it looks like the hardware progress is going to be the critical path. It's a three-way race, even though Europe is very fragmented compared to the US and China. You have a surprising lead of non-US countries. Because I organized the book in 5 different zones. So one is what I call prologue. It's a joke because the prologue is more than 300 pages. So, because useful doesn't mean deployed. Useful doesn't mean scalable. In the end, what costs more is the electronics, not the cryogenics. They have a huge ecosystem that is totally unknown in Europe and in the US.
From OrionX.net, this is the @HPC podcast. Join Shaheen Khan and Doug Black as they discuss supercomputing, AI, quantum technologies, and the applications, markets, and policies that shape them. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the @HPC podcast. I'm Doug Black, and with me is Shaheen Khan. Today, we're very happy to have with us a noted authority on quantum computing, quantum technologies, Olivier Ezratty. Now, it's not easy to quickly sum up Olivier's career and current activities because he is doing and has done so many things. But suffice it to say that Olivier is based in France and internationally active. He is an author, professor, and advisor on quantum technologies, working with businesses and public services. He is also very well known for his open source book, Understanding Quantum Technologies, which is in its 8th edition, the most recently published in 2025. So, Olivier, welcome.
Thank you, Doug.
It's a delight to have you, Olivier. I've been following your work for a number of years now, so really excited to have this opportunity to have a more in-depth discussion. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me, and it was a pleasure to meet you in Santa Clara last time. Yeah.
Yes.
at the Q2B, yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so Olivier, if you would, please give us your general view on the overall state of quantum computing and other quantum technologies presently.
Well, I've been tracking this domain for the last 8 years, so I can at least make a comparison between the beginnings of my journey there and where we are now. Of course, there was a lot of progress. I remember that we had 10 years ago, we had the first IBM systems being put on the cloud with 5 qubits, I think. Then we've seen a lot of progress across all modalities. What I observed, which was striking, was that in this kind of horse race, the order is changing every 2 years. That's so funny. So initially it was about mostly superconducting qubits because of IBM and Google. Then we heard a lot about trapped ions. Then recently, at least since 23, we hear a lot about cold atoms. And maybe someday silicon qubit will jump in the race to a better position than today. We don't know yet. And probably I've got some hope that also photon qubits may become a very challenging technology compared to the 4 others I did mention. There was a lot of progress also both in the science and technology in the software realm. Many things happening in the algorithm domain, mostly in the NISQ era at the beginning. So there's been a lot of work being done in variational algorithms, which I don't like very much personally because I know about all their limitations. It doesn't scale very well. The number of circuit shots is huge, particularly for VQE, for doing chemical simulations. And there's a lot of scaling problems. So I believe a lot in FTQC, so creating logical qubits and fault tolerance, which is in the making right now. So it's still going on. So what I'm expecting for the future is all the progress that vendors and academics are trying to implement in the FTQC domain.
Fault-tolerant quantum computing, yes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Now, can you give us, again, from a high-level perspective, are you generally encouraged, impressed by progress that you're seeing, or are things not moving ahead as you would wish?
Well, I'm kind of in between, kind of wishy-washy. Okay. I don't believe the claim that everything is exponential and we've seen so much progress in the last 12 months. Every year you hear that. If you look objectively about, let's say, the qubit count or even the qubit fidelities, the progress is not that stellar. It does progress, and it depends on the qubit modality. But what I remember is when I started 8 years ago, I mean, many of the promises from some vendors like IonQ, Rigetti, and others were that they even had back then more than 100 qubits. And right now, they even don't have that 8 years later. So these are two vendors. Maybe it's an exception. But even if you take Google, Google, they did their famous Sycamore experiment in October 19 when it was published, and it was 53 qubits. You had to wait 5 years to get to the double. So there's no Moore's law, or at least Moore's law is slow in that space. And they had some increase in the qubit fidelities. But what I see, at least at the hardware level, is how painful it is for all these scientists and vendors to increase both the quality and the quantity of the qubits. It's one against the other. So I've seen amazing results with trapped ions recently with the 3 nines and 4 nines of qubit fidelities, so gate fidelities. So it's the fidelity, so it's 99.9 or 99%, which is very good. But all these have been obtained only with a very small number of physical qubits, sometimes only 2. So I'm expecting, I hope, and it's just hope because the science is different than hope, but I hope that this is going to happen on a larger number of physical qubits, and then we can scale that to a larger number of physical qubits to implement FTQC. But I think it's painful. It's very hard, and particularly when you see all these papers being published on resource estimates for breaking RSA, breaking ECC, and the Bitcoin, you see a kind of dual phenomenon. One is thanks to progress in error correction and some tricks, you are able to decrease the number of physical qubits that are required to break those keys. But if you look at the hardware progress, meanwhile, it's being much slower. So it looks like the hardware progress is going to be the critical path rather than improving error correction, because error correction improves a lot. So even the smaller resource estimates that we have right now for breaking RSA or even doing useful chemical simulation, it's still in the tens of thousands of physical qubits. And moving up from 50 or 100 or so physical qubit to that level is really, it's uncharted territory, even for physics. It's experimental physics has never experimented to control such a large number of entangled objects. So it's like we are doing technology development and trying to find the limits of the Heisenberg cut simultaneously, which is a scientific realm, quest, I would say, and a technology quest all together.
So it's hard to talk about quantum computing without talking about modalities.
Of course,
and one observation is that regardless of modality, some things are easier and some things are harder. And the combination of qubit count and speed and coherence and connectivity and depth and what else did I have? Just the specific functions that something is good at and not good at. And then scaling all of that, the physical to logical ratio, that there's a laundry list of qualifications that need to happen at the same time, and nothing can do it all. If you do this, you can't do that. If you do that, you can't do this. But I think that also what makes advances harder to assess, because somebody solves the problem for their modality that was solved in a different modality that has a different problem. When you look at all of that, that's the usual question. Does one modality emerge as more promising?
Well, at some point, people have beliefs there. So, of course, if you talk to somebody in trapped ion realm, they say they're going to win and the others will lose. Same for photons, same for superconducting qubits. So everybody has complaints about the other. So when you look objectively, they all have some pain, some technology and scientific pain to scale. And it looks like when you look at the detail, particularly on resource estimates, that there's a kind of equalizing in the end. So let me give you an example between the slow and the fast qubits. So we know that solid-state qubits are fast because they have fast gates and fast operations. And the slow qubits, like cold atoms and trapped ions, for various reasons, they are slow. But when you incur for all the cost of error correction, the benefit from using a so-called non-local error correcting code, which have a lower encoding rate than the one you have with a silicon or superconducting qubits, when you count for the so-called constant time overhead codes, which are scaling much better in computing time compared to non-constant time overhead codes that you have with so-called surface codes, with what Google is trying to do. When you embed everything and you look at the literature, in the end, for large circuit execution, it ends up being the same kind of computing time or same range. So there's a kind of equalizing. I can give you another very counterintuitive example, which is more about my one of my favorite topics, which is energetics, which is one of the stuff I
Yes.
do because I co-founded the Quantum Energy Initiative. So I can give you one or two counterintuitive examples. One is cryogenics. So when observers look at the cost of a quantum computer, they fear that cryogenics is a big pain point. And of course, when you look at an IBM or Google or Alice and Bob or an IQM system, the cryogenics looks impressive because it's what's visible. But most of the time, you don't care about all the racks of electronics which are next door to the cryogenics. And what people don't know yet is that when you scale those systems to the FTQC realm with thousands of physical qubits, in the end, what costs more is the electronics, not the cryogenics. And there's a reason for that at the fundamental level. At the fundamental level, when you look at the scales, you need more electricity to power the electronics that creates the qubit drive than to cool even the stuff that's in the cryogenics. So it's counterintuitive. And the other way around, let's take photonic qubits. If you take photonic qubits and PsiQuantum as an example, PsiQuantum, they say, oh, we don't need a cryostat that cools our qubits at 10 millikelvin. Okay, they use only 4 Kelvin. But in the end, for running their system, whether it's going to be 100 or 1,000 or a couple thousand logical qubits, they will need more energy and more cryogenics than IBM and Google and all together. And the system they are installing in Brisbane in Australia and in Chicago in the US, they both will need more than 100 megawatts, which is way beyond what IBM is supposed to cost. IBM has published their numbers. It's less than 10 megawatts. So it's counterintuitive. It's hotter, but you need more cooling power. And there's a reason why. The reason why is that they have to cool everything. They have to cool the photonic source. They have to cool the circuit where the actual computing happens, and they've got to cool the photon detectors. So they need to cool a large set of circuits. They don't cool the routers, but they cool a lot of stuff. So they cool a big mass of systems. And in the end, you need the cooling power of the CERN, the LHC of the CERN, or ITER, the big nuclear fusion systems. So it's so counterintuitive. So hotter means surprisingly more expensive because of all the aspects that you have to embed in that computation.
So one big revelation I got from one of your talks was indeed what you're just pointing to. And my walkaway was that it was a question of scale, that you kind of do a comparison for 1 qubit and then for 5. But then if you make it 1,000,000, different parts of the system scale differently, as is usually the case. And in fact, the energy part may not be the part that is constant or grows really slowly. It may actually grow even faster.
Yeah, it depends on the technology, of course. Yeah, it depends also on your assumptions, because if you look at the vendor's roadmap, there for the few ones which are advertising the energy consumption of their systems, there are only a few, not many of them. They are basing this on various assumptions. Sometimes they're optimistic, sometimes they're not. And in a lot of situations, they are already betting the farm on some technology progress that has not happened yet. So improve in cryogenic yield, for example, improved in electronics, power consumption, improves on cable multiplexing, for example, signals multiplexing and stuff like that. So, but there are still some optimizations which can be done on top of their plans. And there can be also, I hope, a lot of good surprises. For example, I was hitting hard on PsiQuantum, but I know that they're trying to improve their circuits to reduce the so-called photon losses, because all the efficiency of the system depends on the losses. And they've been doing amazing progress recently in the last 3 years with the work they do at Global Foundries I think in the US, in Malta. And they've been able to reduce the losses to a very good level, but they still need to even further improve the loss level in their circuits. But it's going in the good direction. But when you make an objective comparison, the systems are surprisingly very different. And the scale of energy that I showcased at Santa Clara is amazing. You have a scale of 1 to 1,000.
It was a pretty wide scale, that's right.
In power difference, it's a very wide scale. The only case where you could find that in classical technology would be a kind of uneven comparison between an NVIDIA GPU or a set of NVIDIA clusters and the so-called neuromorphic chips or synaptic chips for AI, but they don't do the same stuff. They don't do the training. They are very good for embedded systems. They are not deployed yet at scale, but are supposed also to have a 1,000 gain in energy spending compared to a classical system running, let's say, an NVIDIA GPU. So this is the only case I know where there's such a big gap in a given technology domain. And my belief, that's what I explained in Santa Clara, is at some point, this gap is so big that if those systems deliver the same value computing-wise, I mean, in computing time and computing value and the size of circuit you can run, I think in the end, the energy is going to be on top of the capex. I mean, the cost of the system is going to be a determining competitive figure of merit, which will sort out the good from the bad.
Yeah. So 2 or 3 things come from this conversation I'll come to, but just focusing on the energy part. As you said, my point was that different parts of systems scale differently depending on the modality.
Exactly.
And that is part of the challenge because you do need scale and nobody has quite done it. But you also had done some studies of traditional supercomputer energy use at various supercomputer centers, national labs, and then compare that with what quantum computers would need to do.
Yeah, what the chart that I've been doing is showing is that the spread of power consumption between the future FTQC system is kind of covering the existing spread of HPC systems. So I can give you numbers. If you take the top 10 HPCs in the world, supercomputers, the power range is between 10 megawatt and 38 megawatt. Most of the systems are in the US, a couple of ones are in Europe, one or two in China and Japan. And this is only 10 systems in the world. And then if you take the systems which need a power from 1 megawatt to 10 megawatt, it's about 100 in total, maximum.
Yes.
It's not a lot. So you have 100 systems costing more than 1 megawatt in the world. And now, if you look at the spread of power consumption of future FTQC systems, so quantum systems, it's spread between less than 1 megawatt up to a couple hundreds of megawatt. So the spread is larger, but if you look at the way it's spread, it's kind of overlapping the spread of the current HPC system, but it's going beyond both ways. Mm-hmm. It can be lower, where you could have a potential quantum energy advantage with some technology if they work. And the other way around, it can be worse than the largest systems. And so that's a very surprising observation. Then there is another one, which is a kind of a gut feeling, which is complicated, is can we guess who's going to work best? What I mean work is not from the cost perspective, even from the power perspective, but who actually work at quantum scale. So is there physics or physical law which will favor trapped ions, cold atoms, silicon qubits, superconducting qubits, or photonic qubit, or not? And there's another very old law that I'm kind of wondering about. It's Darwin. Darwin said only the fittest survive. So would that law work for quantum computing? It's a question. I don't have the answer.
Yes,
I would prefer that the fittest survive, meaning the fittest is the one which consumes the less power and drives the creation of a sizable market with a lot of democratization of the usage of quantum computing, if it makes sense, if the algorithms are there, because that's another question. And so if the fittest survive, it's going to be a much larger, much broader, probably a more diverse market. And when I mean diverse, it's not DEI. It's diverse in meaning the kinds of application you will run on those systems. Because otherwise, if the systems are too expensive, they're going to be only used by governments and public research centers. And they're going to be used on the cloud, okay, but they're going to be rented to only a few users. It's going to cost a lot. So it's going to be a very elitistic in the way it's being used. So if you want the technology to become mainstream, even a B2B technology, you need to have a reasonable price. It must be affordable at some point. So that's why I like Darwin in that case.
Right. But nature gets to decide what it means by fit.
Exactly. No, it's not fit. It's the fittest. It's a comparison.
Fittest, exactly. Well, but it defines the metric and then go.
Maybe we're comparing different dinosaurs, but still we want the smallest one.
So in this case, for nature, we're really talking about the market, I assume.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Now, the market is famous for not being so fittest or defined in a way that people don't like, with the Betamax and VHS being the proverbial example. So hopefully
Yeah, but
the
still, people
market will
care
do the
about the
right
cost.
thing
I mean,
here.
in any organization, particularly in the industry,
Yes, sure.
I mean, people, they have a P&L, they have good to look at the cost, and usually you don't buy the most expensive stuff unless you're buying luxury products like a big watch or a nice car. But if you are in a business, you buy, you look at the return on investment, you make an economic reasoning, and you try to have, I mean, the fittest to fit the need. And if there's not a functional difference between two systems, you buy the cheapest one. And I mean, if there's no difference in what it delivers,
Yeah.
that's
Cost effect.
it's a cost effectiveness. So any organization, particularly right now, I've been doing that a long time ago when I was working at Microsoft more than 20 years ago. I learned that IT is still an expense in most organizations. So quantum computing is going to be part of R&D and IT, depending on the organization. So if you are in business operations, it's going to be an IT stuff. If you are in research, it's going to be more a kind of investment in R&D. But in both cases, the budgets are constrained. And so people will look at what's the most affordable solution in the end.
Olivier, now tell us about your open source book, Understanding Quantum Technologies, which is readily findable on Amazon
It's free to download as well.
and free to download as a PDF. Yeah.
Yeah. It's on archive. It's on my website. It's on archive as well. Even though on archive it's not the latest version because it's a pain to update that on archive. If you want the paper, you can buy it on Amazon. Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. So along with maybe describe the book and its purpose, but also why did you publish it under a Creative Commons license as open source?
I've been doing that for 20 years now. I wrote a lot of books before I was in quantum. I started to write a book on entrepreneurship because I went in the startup ecosystem in France. It was in French. Then I wrote a book on consumer electronics. It was actually a book that's very famous only in the French-speaking countries. It was a book which was a kind of a big report on the CS from Las Vegas, where I was going in Vegas every year in January. But it was a compendium of everything happening in the consumer electronic stuff. So I was looking at digital television, photography, semiconductors, everything from tech to marketing. And it was very appreciated. And then 10 years ago, I started in AI. I did the same in AI. The big change which happened with quantum technologies starting 8 years ago, when I started the first edition of the book, is first, there was a lot of science in that book because quantum technologies is about science. It's highly complicated compared to the other topics I mentioned. And then I made a decision in 21 to switch from French to English, which was a turning point in my case, because it made the book available to, of course, a wider audience. In the beginning, it was hard because moving from French to English, all the French complained. All the French people, they complained, I don't read English very well. I say, too bad for you. If you want to be a good specialist in quantum, you need to learn English, if it's not the case yet. And so then the audience grew across multiple countries, all time zones included. But then the book grew to unprecedented size because my largest book before doing quantum was in AI. And the largest edition, the last one, was 750 pages. And now I more than double in quantum because it's 1524. So it's huge. But I mean, you can download this into your own LLM or notebook LM or whatever. You can download in 5 parts the book. You can have a 5-part printed edition. Because I organized the book in 5 different zones. So one is what I call prologue. It's a joke because the prologue is more than 300 pages. So it's the basics of quantum physics history, all the Hall of Fame, and the basics of quantum physics and mathematics and linear algebra and what's a qubit and blah, blah, blah. Then there's energetics inside that and all the transversal issues like error correction. The second book is on the hardware, quantum computing hardware. The third book is only on software, but it covers algorithms first, then software tools, then applications. So 300 pages. And then the fourth one is on telecoms and sensing, which is the covered topic in quantum technologies. And the last one is more geopolitics and social issues. So it's spread across a lot of topics, which is I've been always doing that in all the books I wrote in the past. I was looking always in a 360-degree fashion in a given topic. And I share it because that's been my intellectual and business model for 20 years now. for all the topics I've been covering. And it's been successful because, well, like I explained in the book, people who have time don't have the money to pay anything. So students, for example. And so it creates a huge audience of people who are students. And people who don't have the time, but they have the money, they don't have time to read the book, and they ask me to do the short version, which I get paid for. So it's an asymmetric model, which works very well. And also, there's another reason, which is not business-wise, which is I believe in the dissemination of knowledge and science. We are in a new world where the knowledge should be available, at least common knowledge. And since all the topics I've been covering in my journey in the digital world, it was always about helping people discover a new world. So being publishing open content book in a new domain is a way to make it accessible to a broad audience. It's also the other reason I found with experience was that the more you publish, the more you distribute, the more people want to help you, the more opportunity you have to meet interesting people, both in the academic and the industry domains. And in the case of quantum, it's been the pinnacle of my personal journey in tech. I've never met so many interesting people than in quantum compared to my other experience. I met several Nobel laureates so far in physics. I met so good scientists everywhere in the world. I met all the people from many, many companies, not all, but many, many companies throughout the world. And so I enjoy that experience to meet interesting people, learn from them. Of course, I learn from other sources and reading papers, but learning from the people, having a good network of people, thanks to being a publisher, is a very good helper.
You mentioned that an aspect of your book is technopolitics, or the geopolitics of quantum. And I'm curious if you have views on, we hear a lot about the AI race, which typically focuses on the US versus China. Would you say the stakes are equally high in the quantum race between the US and China? And would their models, their R&D models, which in China are seen as very centralized versus...
You forgot something in your question. You know what?
Go ahead.
I'm an European.
Okay, very good. Yes.
We are in between.
Yes.
We don't see just the planes flying over us. We are a region, and
it's a three-way race.
It's a three-way race, even though Europe is very fragmented compared to the US and China. But still, Europe has a place to take in that world, which of course may be dominated by the US at some point. But there are some jewels in Europe that we shouldn't forget. But whatever. Yeah, there's a race. I wouldn't rate the race as being as important as the AI race. I think the AI race is much more important, more impactful on the lives of everybody. It's going to change a lot of different works. All the knowledge working activities are going to be entirely changed due to AI. The race is a bit different. There are two different aspects for the race in quantum. One is everything that relates to cybersecurity. Because one of the motivation from governments to fund the quantum race, particularly in the US, was the Shor algorithm. It was a defining moment. The idea to create a quantum computer came in the early 80s. So it's a mix of Paul Benioff, Yuri Manin, Richard Feynman in between 79 and 81. Then David Deutsch kind of laid out the basic theory of quantum computing in 85. But it took 9 years for governments to say, this is interesting. That's because of Peter Shor. Because his algorithms drove a mix of fear and hope, saying, we want to have this weapon. So every government said, we want to be the first to have this weapon. So, I mean, the federal government in the US, whatever whether it was a Democrat or a Republican, they were willing to get hands on that technology. So there was a lot of funding. And surprisingly, it drove a lot of excitement and a lot of interest. If you look, for example, at the first trapped ion quantum computers, they were created just after that. I know the folks who did that, like Rainer Blatt in Innsbruck, with Peter Zoller and Ignacio Chirac. They created the first trapped ion system in 95, 96, just after Shor. And Shor was a motivation to do that because there was this kind of kind of fear and hope all together. So that drove a lot of interest. Same for superconducting qubits. I mean, the first one was created in 1999 by Yasunobu Nakamura in Japan, and then in France in 2002, and then in the US in Yale. And so the race came from that. The second reason I see, and particularly that's why in Europe we are interested by this, is it's a new playing ground. I mean, we don't know yet what's going to be the winning technology. There may be a couple winning technologies, not just one. There's still hope that somebody somewhere can find a way, mostly with the collaborative work, but can find a way to be a company that counts in this new market. So there's hope that a new ground creates new hope for getting a slice of this new pie. That's the second reason. Then there is a third one, which is kind of wishy-washy, which is every government is over selling and over amplifying their investment in that domain. And some governments are honest, I would say, particularly the US. The US is kind of honest in the publicity they do at the federal level on the government investment and what they actually do. It's kind of synchronized. But in some countries, there's a big gap. In some countries, you have numbers which are floating around and the real numbers are much lower. I won't name names, but it happens in several countries. And there's the most mysterious one is China, because you see numbers popping up here and there, and nobody actually knows what's the real number. Even China doesn't know, or even people from China know that the public numbers, which don't necessarily come from China, by the way, are not the right ones. And so there's kind of a fuzzy understanding of the situation in China, but which, by the way, is true for all their economics. Yeah. I mean, many numbers are wrong and fake in the economics of this kind of country. So you never know really what's the good number, but not just in quantum. There's another example which I hate, which came from last year. Last year, around May, Japan announced a $7 billion plan. That plan was embedding a huge industry investment in semiconductor manufacturing, particularly for memory and flash memory. And there was some quantum stuff inside that plan. So what happens is everybody believes that Japan has a $7 billion quantum plan, which is not true. So the trick of the trade in some countries is to merge quantum in a broader technology quest, typically with AI or semiconductors, and then you have a big plan which includes quantum, and everybody's getting confused about what's a real quantum plan.
It's just a bigger number that covers a lot of different things, but includes the laundering.
So you got a lot of wrong numbers. So I did this weekend, I did an experiment. I dumped all the archive metadata on my laptop, and I did some analysis using Python and stuff like that. And I found out that I could make a comparison between the number of papers and the number of authors publishing papers on archive between AI and quantum. And of course, there's a gap. And the gap is about 1 to 20.
Oh, smaller than I thought, actually.
It's not that big, given the importance, the current importance of AI. And there's always a trick, because the way you manage your keywords in the when you interrogate your database may bias the system, but whatever. So it looks like quantum is not that small compared to AI, but still it's 5% of the total.
Yeah.
So it's a much smaller ecosystem in academics. So if you count the number of authors, and I've seen some other sources trying to extract the same number, I think there are about 20,000-ish authors in quantum papers right now.
That's really interesting analysis. One thing that I observe is that, unlike AI, that almost crept up on people. It was like not there, and then it's suddenly there, and it works better than you thought it does, and it's using GPUs, and I thought those were just for graphics. Quantum computing has been such a clean split that everybody has seen the movie before, and everybody has quantum physicists, all the countries, I mean. Yeah. So therefore, there's an opportunity to participate. It hasn't, the barriers to entry have not raised yet. So I see quantum computing efforts everywhere in the world, whereas it is much harder to see semiconductor manufacturing at the high end everywhere in the world.
Yeah, there's something, I don't know if it's so much different compared to classical computing, but at least there are two things. One is, of course, what we call enabling technologies. So there's a lot of value in the electronics, in the photonics and the cryogenics. And if you look at the cost of a quantum computer, that costs a lot. And so there's value in being a leader in that space. And so, for example, if you look at the leaders in some of the quantum technologies, you have a surprising lead of non-US countries.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the number one leader in the world in cryogenics? You know? Blue Force, Finnish company. Finland. I don't know if the Americans know where Finland is. It's a 5 million habitant country, 5 million people.
It's an important country, yes.
It's a small country, worldwide leader in cryogenics, and they have IQM on top of that. Who's one of the worldwide leaders in control electronics for superconducting qubits? It's an Israeli company, Quantum Machines. Who's the worldwide leader in lasers? It's a German company, Toptica. Who's the worldwide leader in so-called error syndrome detection in error correction? It's a smaller business, but still it's an important one. Riverlane, UK company. So who's the worldwide leader in superconducting cables? It's a Japanese company called Quackco. So when you look at all these different aspects, you have not a big company. It's not like a Google or IBM, but it's a small company, a small business, we would say, or Mittelstand in Germany, you would say, but that company is not in the US necessarily. And it can be even in a very small country.
Yeah, this is a great segue into, I was going to ask you, when we look at geopolitics of quantum computing and technology in general, the common conversation is really about how Europe is falling behind. It's not investing as much. It's like, you have to herd the cats and it's too fragmented. But in fact, as you mentioned, you look at all the examples that you mentioned, plus Carl Zeiss, plus ASML, plus,
of course, yeah,
AMI, plus all, this, that, and the other. There are several really strongholds. How do you assess the relative strengths of technology in a geographic sense?
Well, in the case of quantum or in general? It's
let's start with quantum.
Yeah, in the case of quantum, the examples I gave show that there's some leadership that can come from Europe, but sometime it started, in the case of ASML, it started 4 years ago, so it's a long story. It takes time to create a leader. And in the case of Toptica, it was created about 25 years ago, I think.
Yes.
So many of the examples, even rare isotopes, for example, we produce that in Europe as well. So we don't depend on the US. So that's another example with some raw materials. So there are many situations where you can create leadership. The big $100 question we have is it possible in quantum computing per se? So with a quantum vendor. Will IQM, Pascal, Alice and Bob, Candela, and Planck or Electron or AQT, will they strive against the leaders from the US? That's a way more difficult question. My belief so far is that, of course, if you look at the funding goes into the US in priority, but that's where you get the money. You have all these packs happening right now. And the other observation I make, based on the comparisons we used before, the ASML, Toptica, and others, is if in some country there's a good ecosystem that helps a company to strive with a good differentiation at the technology and the scientific level, it may help compete successfully with China in the US. It may. It's not obvious, but it may help. If you don't have a technology superiority, you lose. Because the financial power, the marketing power from this large geography that is the US makes it much more difficult for a fragmented region like Europe. So you need to have very good technology and scientific differentiation. And when I look at the details of the strategies of all the companies, there's some hope for a couple of companies, maybe not 12 or 20, but there's some hope from at least, let's say, 5 to 10 companies in Europe which could strive, but they would need funding, of course. There's a big project in Europe to create a large cap funding for these kind of companies in deep tech. That it's, of course, the same obvious question about the funding. What I believe strongly, and I've been advocating that with the government at the French level and the EU level, is that there's no unique market in Europe. You got to make a difference between the market and the demand and the offer. It's very complicated to sell in countries where you have different language, different culture, maybe the same currency. Euro is the same currency, but it's hard to sell, particularly in the consumer space, the same way in the US, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Italy. The culture is different. But what we can do is a bit like Airbus and similar companies. We can build multinational companies which gather the cultures and the strengths from different countries and create European companies. I think that's easier than to sell products throughout Europe in a consistent way.
I see.
So at least from this perspective, there's some hope in Europe that we consolidate some of the offering. There are many ways to do that. And we have to be fast, of course, because if otherwise all the American companies will acquire European companies. So that there's some hope that some stuff can be done. It's about strategy. So we have to be quiet about this.
Right.
But it's about building a strategy and being able to gather the forces. And you look, for example, one way to look at this is to look at the supply chain. Look at the supply chain, what's upstream and downstream when you create a quantum computer. So upstream, you have all the hardware components, like the ones I mentioned. And downstream, you have the applications, mostly software and software tools and applications. So when you build an ecosystem and you create a new company, you have to build your ecosystem upward and downward, or upstream, downstream.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the case, there are many companies we miss either one or both of them when they build their ecosystem. So that's what we have to learn on the past and AI and all the digital revolutions from the last 40 years. We've got to learn from that and build good ecosystems. And it's the same for China, by the way. China will have the same challenge.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at China objectively right now, they may have some big amounts invested in the public academic space. We have Jian Weipan, who is very famous, driving stuff in Hefei. But if you look in details, the strengths and weaknesses of China are way different from those from the US, for example. So they were the best in the world to experiment at scale quantum communications. Because in Europe and in the US, there was a government kind of skepticism about the interest of using the so-called QKD to distribute cryptographic keys. And particularly in the US, there was a belief that the NIST-driven PQC was the thing to do and not quantum communication. Now it's changing in the US and Europe because everybody knows that you need quantum communication to connect quantum objects like quantum computers and quantum sensors. It's changing. So that's what's the strength of China. If you look at quantum computing, they fare not badly in photonics, even though not at a commercial level. It's mostly experiments like boson sampling experiments, which are useless at this point in time in computing. And they have a lot of things happening in superconducting qubits. But so far, they've not done better than IBM and Google and even European companies. So they are kind of imitating what the US are doing. They've got a 1 to 2 years lag, which is not a lot for China. They can cope with that. They even are trying to develop their own cryogenic fridges. So they want to be independent. So they develop a lot of custom electronics, a lot of cryogenics on their own. They want to be self-sufficient. But so far, they're not as good as the Western world. But never say never. So it can change. And if at some point they want to export, they just sold a cold atom quantum computer to Pakistan. I wouldn't. Well, it's a strange export, but whatever. They try to export some of the stuff they do in non-aligned countries. So we have to watch carefully what they do. And the third one in China, which is not very known and not widely discussed, is what they do in sensing.
Right.
They have a huge ecosystem that is totally unknown in Europe and in the US, which is an ecosystem of quantum sensing for the army. So it's military. There are many companies who don't have a Western name, that just have the name of the city, limited something, and a complicated name. And maybe there are four different names sometimes. It's always very hard to Google them. And you can find them only on a search in China, like Baidu search engine. And if you want to know what they do, it's kind of stealth because they work for the military. So that's something we don't know well yet. And sometimes they are also overselling what they do. They say that they can detect the nuclear submarines, they can detect stealth aircraft. So it's hard to check that. And the scientists are very skeptical about that, at least in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, advancement of science has historically benefited from free flow of information around the world
Yeah,
and just kind of move forward. And when you restrict that, when you add friction to that, it's a much harder challenge for all the players.
yeah. I've seen that coming. Some scientists are really not happy with the situation. They see exports controls coming from the NATO countries mostly. And there's also a limitation in the exchanges, scientific exchanges we can have with China. And we still have a lot of very good scientists in China. I remember I saw something from Austin Fowler. I don't know if you know this guy. Austin Fowler, he was a surface code scientist working at Google. He left Google last year and he's on his own now. And he was interviewed recently in a podcast that I watched. Interestingly, he said something that is striking. It's so difficult to create a viable large-scale quantum computers that it should be a worldwide journey with
Yes.
attracting all the talents in the world. And so all the fragmentation, all the stuff happening in all the countries want to be the leader in the world and kind of ring fence what they do against the other. This is not good for science because the science is very complicated. And I have been observing that on my own. What I've been observing is that there are two things happening which limit the speed at which we make progress. One is too many people work in silos. There's not enough interdisciplinary across the disciplines. That's what I'm discovering when looking at the energetics of those systems. Because when you look at energetics, you have to look at everything. You need to look at the software, the compiler, the error correction, control, the cryogenics, the qubit themselves, the quantum physics, quantum thermodynamics. You need to look at all the stack. But you need to have people working together. You need to create a kind of holistic model which embed all the figures of merit. So it's complicated. Unless you are in a large company like with IBM or Google or a large startup, it's very hard to do in the academic world. So you need more collaboration between those things. And the other thing we can observe, and that's what Austin was saying, and I observed that on my own, there's a lot of duplication. So
yes,
government funding everywhere funds the same stuff. You've got the same teams doing the same stuff and repeating the same experiments, and you lose a lot of, I would say, efficiency. But you can control that like if you were the Chinese government or the USSR government with a big hierarchical control of everything. It's impossible. But there's probably some efficiencies, improvements to put in place in part of the ecosystem to make sure that there's more collaboration to reach that. The problem we have right now, compared to the Manhattan Project or even the early computers, ENIAC and stuff like that, what's happening is we went into a commercial domain kind of too quickly, but for good reasons.
Yeah.
There are good and bad reasons. The good reason is you can't create a complex product in an academic setting. There are very few places in the world where you can do that. Even NASA, if you take NASA, the Apollo program was, it was Rockwell and Boeing, if I remember well, and Lockheed Martin. They were doing the Saturn V and everything. So NASA was an integrator. It was not the industry company. So you still needed an industry to win the race to the moon. And it's still the case today, by the way. So, so if you look at the way the race was organized, we went into creating many startups everywhere in the world because the governments had a kind of over-expectation of the economic value brought out by quantum computers. So they gave money to the startups instead of giving money to the academics. The academic world is not well organized to create a product. And so in the end, it creates a kind of strange loop where you create large teams in the commercial world. So they have to bullshit what they do. They get to get an investor. They get to overhype what they do. And they get to be closer than what you do in the academic world. So what would be good would be to be able to keep the openness, the international openness of the academic research and make sure that the academic world connects well with the industry world. But it's a very competitive world, so we have to accept that situation. But there are probably some efficiencies and collaboration. Maybe that will come from some adverse effect, which is called consolidation. So market consolidation, that's the big buzzword with IonQ buying Oxford Ionics and Skywater or whoever. So the consolidation may be a driving force for making optimizations. But the other thing we know from large organizations is the larger the organization is, the less efficient it is usually. So it's complicated.
Olivier, very curious. We've been hearing some reports from some vendors that they have customers that are actually doing useful work with quantum. Do you have views in this part of the field?
It depends what you rate as a customer and what you rate as useful. So,
well, how real is this stuff
yes.
is the question.
yeah. So I can tell you what I feel is real and what's not real. What's real is in the last 2 years, we've seen, I would say, case studies being deployed or tested on D-Wave systems, on IBM systems, on Continuum systems, to name the few leaders, maybe Pascal and Quera to some extent, where there was a kind of beginning of a quantum advantage to solve very specific problems. And the specific problems we know that were solved in a near quantum advantage regime were mostly quantum physics problems.
Yes.
So it was about simulating mainly material science stuff. So ferromagnetism, spin models, usually very theoretical models, which are running at 0 Kelvin, which is very cool. And so it was in most of the cases I know of about helping fundamental physics research do simulations in a pure academic setting without industry relevance. That's where we are right now, even though there are some people from the classical computing world using tensor networks, which are kind of arguing about what can be done classically to do the same kind of computation. But still, we are in a situation where the first use cases are in that space. And if you look at the theory, it makes a lot of sense. Because if you take the idea from Richard Feynman, which was about using a quantum system to simulate another quantum system, because I would say the semantics are not that far, it makes a lot of sense that this is what works now. The closer you are with a spin model, particularly, not fermionic model, a spin model, the closer you are, the happier you're going to be, because you can have a lower overhead. And if you take the case of D-Wave, or even the cold atoms, when you want to optimize combinatorial optimization problem and solve this kind of problem, you have a technique called embedding, which is converting the structure of your problem into the problem that the computer can solve. And the difference in semantics creates an overhead which is much larger than when you solve a spin model. And so as a result, the overhead is larger and the quantum advantage is not that obvious. And so when I hear D-Wave saying, I've got a solution that works, that's deployed in some retail company in Canada or whoever in some other country, I'm very skeptical. Now, the other reason why I'm skeptical in that case, in that particular case, is that D-Wave is using a so-called hybrid solver. This hybrid solver is a black box. It's not open science. The way they use this hybrid solver to rely on the D-Wave annealer on one hand and the classical solver on the other hand is not publicly documented. And all the anecdotal evidence I have about this is not very good for D-Wave. So I would like the company to be more open on what's the load that it's on their annealer and what's the load that is on relying on the classical system. In the case of IBM and the gate-based systems, it's more open. It's easier to audit. It's easier to benchmark. So I trust more what they do. But IBM and Quera and others, they have not claimed quantum advantage on the optimization problem so far. Mm-hmm. So it's mostly about physics simulation. So that's where we are today. So when a company says, I have a useful case, well, you have to take that with a lot of grains of salt, usually, because useful doesn't mean deployed. Useful doesn't mean scalable. And people are always gaming with language and semantics here. So if you take the exact words that are used by companies, they are all semi-lies, I would say. Because an industry use case is mostly, in all cases, a use case, not a case study. And I use the semantic that the case study is something from the past that you have experimented, that you can audit, where you can learn lessons from what you have deployed on the cost, on the optimization, everything. And the use case is for the future. So a use case is something you plan to do when the system is available. So right now we have more use case than case studies. When you have somebody who says, I have a deployed industry case study, usually it's a toy model that was tested on 4 physical qubits, which could be done on your laptop, by the way, or even a Raspberry Pi, because 4 qubit is really a picnic for any classical computing system. And of course, it's not deployed, because I don't know any company who would like to deploy a solution on a $10 million machine, which could be deployed on a laptop or a 1U server in the cloud. So these are toy models in most cases. So the story is going to change when you exit the toy model era. And it's the same for VQE, for chemical information. It's the same for QAOA. It's the same for all the stuff I see in academic papers where it's being tested on less and fewer than 20 qubits. And there's a reason why. Why is it always tested on between 4 and 20 qubits in many, many cases? It's because variational algorithms don't scale very well.
Yeah.
Because when you reach a large number of physical qubits, you need to have a lot of circuit shots. You have the so-called Barron plateau, which prevents you from converging your optimization loop with the classical optimizer. So it makes it very difficult. So for classical variational algorithms, actually the most interesting algorithms that were deployed recently or tested recently on IBM systems were non-variational algorithms. There are non-variational algorithms which work better, but they require some preparation, classical preparation. And there's some interesting stuff happening there. So it's a complicated world, I would say.
Yeah. So we
deployed at scale, no way.
Right. So we can say it's more or less the same as before, that the market is for those who are experimenting with the technology and are working to be prepared for when it is ready for scale.
Exactly. And this learning curve is very useful because we know that in any industry, it takes time to learn a new paradigm. And so since quantum computing is a new paradigm, and since it's highly complicated, and one of the reasons it's complicated is the complexity is not where you think it is. Usually people think that the complexity is about developing a quantum circuit because it's new. But when you look at the actual case studies, particularly in chemical simulations, which are the big chunk of the potential market, when you look at the work that you have to do, and you know that because you know about HPC in your case, you know that the heavy workload is in the classical side of your system because you got to prepare your ground state, you got to prepare your circuit, you got to do a lot of pre-computation. And this classical pre-computation is using a DFT or FCI or R3-Fork simulation, stuff like that. It's classical stuff. And so if you want to, in a company, even a financial service company, if you want to be a good developer of a quantum solution, or even if you're a service company, you need to master both quantum circuits, which are totally new, but you need to master the rest.
Right.
And the rest is a heavy workload. So you need to have teams which, I put that in my book, I think, a while ago, which is you got 3 skills to assemble. One is quantum computing programming. One is classical computing programming using the most modern tensor networks or whatever machine learning tools that there are. And the third one is know your industry.
Discipline, yeah.
So financial mathematics, chemical mathematics, and stuff like that. So you need 3 skills in an organization or in an ecosystem to assemble a solution. So the learning curve is long, and it explains why it's good to spend time now. And there's another reason, which I discovered recently, which is large customers who usually create a small team in quantum computing. They hire very good people there. So it's a way to attract talent, and there's competition for talent. So if you breed a small team of high talented people in quantum computing and on top of that on classical computing, you may be able to expand your knowledge about mathematics, your knowledge about modern computing, and even if quantum computers take some time to be working in production, you're going to upscale your teams, whatever you do.
Yeah.
So there's always a benefit, an intellectual benefit, which may have a return on investment because it's going to help your company to be more efficient in mathematics, in solving complicated problems, whatever the technology that's being used.
And that really is for public money towards quantum computing. That's really a very nice fallback position, that even if nothing happens, just gathering that many highly qualified people is bound to do something good for society. So it's a good spend of money in that sense.
Whatever the domain, by the way, it's financial services, chemical simulation, life science, logistics, whoever. I mean, even government, defense, stuff like that. So everywhere, you're going to have some benefit from looking at this edge of science. And it's so funny because sometimes people ask me, why are you in this domain, given it's a very small market, it's not growing as fast as people are thinking? I say, I've never seen so interesting a domain. Because you look at everything. You look at science, you look at technology, you look at electronics, you look at case studies in multiple domains. I've never been so intellectually challenged than in this quantum world. And so it's a reason why there are interesting people there. And that's why
Hmm.
if you like science, if you like intellectual challenges, you stay there.
Yeah, yeah.
And you move
Well,
around. You move around in between those different domains within the quantum space.
I was curious about your book. One topic it looks into is alternatives to quantum and classical
Oh, yeah, yeah.
supercomputing. What are some?
It's unconventional computing, I call it. Yeah.
unconventional.
Unconventional computing. Yeah, there's a chapter on that. It's the last part of the hardware part of the book. And you found that interesting?
Well, I'm just curious what you deem the leading candidates for.
Oh, in that space? Oh, it's very hard to say. I see a surge in photonics computing companies right now. There are many, many companies being created because photonics is fast, it's very energy efficient. So, but that's what I used to say to people who fear the Shor algorithm, the quantum computers breaking RSA everywhere. I say maybe the fear is not well placed. I say to them, maybe you should look at unconventional computing because even though the companies are not very well funded compared to AI and quantum space, those companies are sometimes very interesting, under assessed. I would say there are not enough people looking at what they do. The theory is maybe not clear enough, but in some cases, I think that some of these companies may be able to deliver power improvements compared to classical systems, probably not as far as quantum computers, maybe in a shorter time. So I believe it makes sense to look at them. And the other reason I look at this is in some cases, it can help quantum computing. Let me give you two examples.
Mm-hmm.
One is a so-called coherent Ising model in photonics. There's one quantum company which is looking at this. It's the combination of HPE and Colab, the company created by Alan Ho and John Martinis. And when they published their kind of blueprint late 24, they explicitly explained that they believed that quantum computing would be good for quantum chemistry, but not for optimization. And the guys from HPE with Mohsen Marzeni and I forgot the name, Ray Beausoleil, I think, which is a very old researcher at HPE, they decided that solving optimization problems would rely on coherent Ising model or unconventional computing, which is not quantum computing. So it's a combination. This is one example. The other one is another unconventional computing technology that I'm carefully looking at. It's superconducting computing, which is not superconducting qubits. So it's computing that works at very low temperature, that's using, let's say, the equivalent of transistor based on Josephson junctions, like what we do in quantum. But it's using classical logic. And this classical logic is operating at very low temperature, and it may be very power efficient. And also, it may be very fast. You could theoretically, and it was experimented a while ago, go up to 700 gigahertz. It's a lot compared to a 3 gig or 1 gig from NVIDIA GPUs right now. So it could be very efficient. So that could be a way, but it's been tried for 40 years now. There was a IARPA, NSA program a while ago, which didn't bring any fruitful results, but still it's an area of investigation. And why is it important? It's important because if at some point this works, this will enable the creation of control electronics operating at very low temperature to control qubits, like superconducting qubits. There's one company which I know very well called SICK. They're based in New York State, upstate New York. They are in where are they exactly? I forgot. I think they are in Elmsford, north of New York, not far from White Plains, where IBM is located, and White Plains and Yorkton Heights. And I went there 2 years ago. And so they are developing control electronics for qubits. And it came from this big realm where companies were trying to do classical computing running at very low temperature. So these are two examples of kind of cross-pollination of technology between different fields.
But all of these, Olivier, are, well, not all of them, but really the genre is a little bit of a science project out there, may or may not happen. And in some ways, it's sort of indicative of like the world we live in, which pushes us more and more upstream to unbaked, unproven technology because it might work.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it would be much better to plug that into the existing academically driven process and let it be proven out, like you said earlier about quantum
Yeah, yeah.
computing
But
too.
there are
That
companies who are trying. So let's let the company try to do that, and then it's up to them to find the funding. And sometimes it's difficult for them. But recently, I think SIC got a very good funding round. I forgot the level. I think they got a funding round valuing them at $1 billion, which was not bad
maybe that's the
for
new
an
model,
enabling
is
tech.
that maybe that's the new model of funding, is that you start with a concept, maybe from academia, and then it gets funded. Now it has to make money. And if it doesn't make money, it goes back to academia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But of course, well, one thing is you shouldn't put all your eggs on the same basket, but still you need to focus at some point. So the strategy is about making choices, and so
Yep.
it's a trade-off between making choices and hedging your bets. So that's
And
it's
it's fundamentally
complicated.
complex.
It's
Yeah.
fundamentally complex, and it's about gut feelings. It's about knowing the science that's behind all these things.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do. It's funny because as I've been exploring that space for 8 years now, I've been having the feeling that the more you know, the more you may become skeptic, because you know all the difficulties that the people share to build those systems. But the more you know, the more you understand what people are trying to do. And it makes you being confident to some extent as well. So because you know that people are working on the hard tasks. So I'm kind of having always mixed feelings about that. I know how hard it is. So when I see the roadmaps, which are kind of crazy, I say, maybe it's too optimistic. But I still have some trust in the people trying many things and knowing what's hard, and there's some ingenuity being deployed and some workarounds being invented to fix various set of problems. So it's what makes the situation interesting. By the way, I've got a kind of joke about that, which I try to use. The joke is, there was a French guy from BCG, Jean-François Bobier. I know him very well. He was, by the way, at Santa Clara. And he wrote something back in 21 saying, it's not a matter of if, it's only when, about when we have a useful quantum computer. And so I said, well, you are violating the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle with this. So I said, you must accept that the if is uncertain to find a way to get the when.
Exactly.
Because otherwise, you've got some kind of complementary variables where if you are not uncertain on the if, it means that the when is totally uncertain from now to infinite.
Exactly.
And so if you want to have a better precision, it's squeezing. It's called squeezing in quantum physics. So if you want to have a better precision on when it's going to happen, you need to accept that the if is still an if. It's just a joke by analogy, but it works very well in practice, because if you understand that there's questions, you look at the questions, you look at the challenges, and then you look at how people are going to address the challenge. Sometimes you see challenges which have no response yet. Sometimes you see challenges where there are multiple options that have to be tested, and it takes time. That's why the when is uncertain, because you have to test maybe 10 options with 5 topics in your system. So one example is interconnect. So how do you interconnect QPUs? So how do you interconnect quantum computers with quantum interconnect? It's very complicated, because you've got losses all along the path, and efficiency are not that good. It may be costly, you don't know. You have a cost of compiling your code because you've got circuit partitioning all over the place. So that's complicated. So some physicists are saying it's difficult up to impossible. Others are trying. So let's let people try to do that and see what happens. So
yeah.
I liked your observation that really in an ideal world, this is such a complex, huge problem. The world really should come together to solve quantum computing. But in the world we're in,
we take it as it is, or like we say.
Not very likely to happen.
Well, if you're a Star Trek fan, we are a little bit far away from Starfleet Command.
Of course, yeah.
The planetary, yeah.
It's more Star Wars right now than Star Trek.
Yeah. Nice.
All right.
Very good.
Well, that's all the questions I have.
Well, I have many more, but
you?
It's been well over an hour, and it's
as you like.
your time.
If you have a couple of ones, if you have a couple of ones, I can respond to that, and then you edit.
Well, maybe I will ask one final one, and that is really fidelity versus error correction. I've seen that discussion most vividly when Jack Krupansky posted that we need a certain minimum level of fidelity before error correction can really be used. As an analogy, we look at our existing classical computing where there is error correcting code, but it's not relied upon as
It's
heavily
very different. It's very
as
different
it
in
is.
classical computing.
But maybe we need a few more nines before error correction can actually. What is your perspective on that?
We don't need many nines. We need 3 nines to have functional error correction. We don't need 4 nines, 5 nines. There's a kind of
No. The idea was that if you want to scale the overhead of error correction as something that is relied upon so heavily, makes it untenable. That's at least how I understood it. But if you have a lot more nines, then error correction is there, but it's not invoked so often.
Yeah, but when I wrote my paper on error correction recently, it's a 45-page paper that's on my blog. I found out something interesting. It's called the law of diminishing returns. It says that, and you can see that very easily in the curve that's being published in 2012 about the efficiency of surface codes. It's a curve like this. And so the curve shows that you have the so-called threshold. The threshold, which is dependent on the architecture, is the fidelity. And I will explain what's fidelity, by the way, but the fidelity at which you start to have an error correction code which will create a logical qubit that's better than the physical qubit. But what we know is when you are right on the threshold, the size of your logical qubit is infinite. So you need thousands of physical qubits. It doesn't make any sense. So it's an asymptotic curve. So what you need in practice to create a functional logical qubit is you need a 10-fold increase in fidelity, or in error rate, by the way, a decrease in error rate compared to the threshold. So let's say the threshold, the 32 threshold is 99%. You will need 99.9% fidelity on your physical qubit so that your surface code or your color code or equivalent works. But then if you go on increasing the fidelity, the gain is going to be not that big. The gain is significant when you move from 99 to 9999. But when you go to 4 nines, 5 nines, the gain is not that good. And so we know that it's so difficult to move to 4 nines and 5 nines in most of the technologies. And by the way, the control electronics is limited at 6 nines. So whatever you do, the electronics will not be good at better than 6 nines, as far as I know. I've seen some papers from the Dutch on that a while ago. It's the fundamental limitations on the electronics control. And it's the same for lasers, by the way. So
that's interesting.
You can't go beyond 6 nines physically. But if you reach 3 nines, it's enough to get functional error correction. But then the problem is, how do you get 3 nines at scale? Because right now, I mean, the only company and technology which is reaching 3 nines are small-scale trapped ions. Continuum is having 3 nines, but it doesn't work very well in practice as far as I know. But IonQ with the Oxford Ionics, they reach 4 nines for 2-qubit gates, but only with 2 qubits. So I'm expecting that they release someday this year. They are promised a 256 chip from OI, so Oxford Ionics in the UK. And I hope they're going to deliver at least 3 nines based on that. We'll see. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to work. But 3 nines is going to be enough to scale. But then you need to have this at scale. And so one thing that is not well understood is what is this 3 nines about? The 3 nines is about all the operations fidelities. So you need a 3 nines for the 2 toughest ones. The gate tough one is the 2-qubit gate, so CNOT, CZ, or ISWAP, depending on the physical implementation. The second one, which is harder, is a readout. All the papers, mostly the recent papers which were published by Iceberg Quantum, Oratomic, Google, and so on breaking ECC or RSA, they were all based on 3 nines fidelities, and the 3 nines includes readout, theoretically, as far as I know, theoretically. So some error correction codes can be relaxed about what they need on the 2-qubit gate in some situations for error syndrome measurements, and sometimes also on the measurement. And you have to look at the details. What is the actual error rate that you can tolerate for all the figures of merit? But if you are just looking at the basic science and basic theory, you need 3 nines in 2-qubit gate and measurement. And it's hard to get at scale. Particularly the 2-qubit gate, because the 2-qubit gate is hard to get at scale because of crosstalk and a lot of side effects and the correlated errors and stuff like that, which at scale would create some mess depending on the qubit type. So, but sometimes the good error that people like to have, particularly in cold atoms, is a loss of atom, which creates a so-called erasure error. It's weird because looking from far away, you say, oh, it's bad to lose the atom. But actually, it's easy to detect. So an error that's easy to detect is not as bad as an error that's hard to detect,
You can solve it, perhaps. Yeah.
like a Pauli error, a small error in a physical qubit that doesn't move. So a leakage error or erasure error where you lose the state or you lose even the object itself, a loss of the quantum object, this loss error is easier to detect. That's why the guys from QCI were acquired by D-Wave, because D-Wave acquired this company, which was created by Rob Shulko from Yale. And this company is using a superconducting qubit and the technology called dual rail. And the dual rail make it easy to detect an error, an erasure error. So when the error is a big one but easy to detect, it's better than a small error that's harder to detect. And another reason why it's interesting, it's because of the cost of error syndrome detection. Because error syndrome detection is very costly because it's using a graph-based mechanism that's classical, that scales very badly with the size of your surface code, and it's very expensive. So it's interesting to know that and to be able then to compare those different platforms.
Well, that was the motivation for more nines, was for errors to not be present to begin with, so that when they do happen, it is more rare.
What Jack is saying, what Jack is probably thinking about is to make NISQ viable systems. So let's say you have a 4 nines. If you have a 4 9, in theory, without error mitigation, which by the way doesn't scale well also, you can scale up to 10,000 gates.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the circuits that people are designing, whether it's for doing a chemical simulation, optimizations, portfolio optimization, or even short breaking, you need billions of gates minimum. It's 10 power 9 to 10 power 12. It's way above the 10K. So you need scalable error correction in the end. Because of the circuit size. The circuit size demands error correction.
No, I'm not saying let's eliminate error correction. I'm saying that if error correction has non-trivial overhead in terms of bandwidth processing, it is therefore best if you do not have errors. Now, occasionally you're going to have errors, and then you can do the overhead, but not so much.
Yeah, but okay, if it was easy to get a 5 nines, it would have been done. It's hard. I mean, it's so hard. But I can give you an example. Some of the good academics in this world and the good companies, they do benchmarking, of course, and they try to understand where is the noise coming from. So they try to detect the source of the noise. And recently, there were a couple of very interesting papers from IQM and others explaining in details for trapped ions, for superconducting qubits and others, where the noise was coming from. So you budget the errors. And then when you have a good budget of the source of errors, you can say, oh, I'm going to focus on these two things. And maybe I'm going to improve that. So you can focus on the quality of electronics, the quality of the signal. You can focus on the isolation. That's why you use tunable couplers in superconducting qubits. You can focus on other aspects of the design of the qubit itself when it's not an atom. In the case of an atom, you have to focus on the photonics that controls the atom. You can focus on the types of energy transitions, because the energy transitions are not the same if it's an hyperthin transition or if it's an optical transition. So, because on one way, you're going to use a microwave drive, which can be local, and on the other way, you're going to use a photonic drive, which uses lasers and laser beams and laser shaping devices, which are complicated. So there are many ways. Another example of the things people are trying to do is they are trying to replace the so-called SLAMs, the spatial light modulators, and the AOD, the acoustic optical deflectors that are used in cold atom systems. They want to replace that with nanophotonic circuits, which are using meta surfaces, which are shaping the light in a much more efficient way than what we do with SLMs and AODs. So that's an enabling tech. And it's being experimented in many places in Europe and in the US. And there are so many things to address to reduce the noise. That's a lot of technology development.
Yeah.
And experiments and characterization.
Yeah. Well, excellent. And thank you. We definitely are way over now.
Thank you, Olivier. Really a great tour of the quantum world. And it's been a pleasure, really.
Thank you, guys. Yep.
Yeah, really a total delight. Thank you, Olivier. Thank you for being generous with your time, and really looking forward to seeing you in person again and having conversations like this again.
I know I'm back on my papers.
Thanks so much.
See you next time. Bye-bye, guys.
Brilliant. All right.
Au revoir.
Bye-bye.
Oh, why indeed.
That's it for this episode of the At HPC podcast. If you like the show, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Every episode is posted on orionx.net. Contact us with any questions or proposed topics of discussion. The At HPC podcast is a production of OrionX. Thank you for listening.